Okay, are you ready to start?
Yeah, you want to do it?
Yeah.
What do you got? What do you got written down? Or you came with some notes today.
Happy 2-year.
Happy to. Have we been doing this for 2 years?
No.
Oh,
Happy 2-year. That's what I'm saying instead of Happy New Year. Happy 2-year.
why 2 year?
Okay, so I came across, I was looking at year-end stuff, 2024 projections, 2025, looking at climate projections and economic and this and that. I came across an article where the source was kind of the head of the climate change strategy thing for the UN. It's a guy named Simon Steele. Simon Steele he's not the head of the World Meteorological Organization, which is the UN weather branch, but he's sort of the strategist, the chief strategist for addressing climate change on a multinational level. So, the COPs, these annual climate summits, they just had one in November in Azerbaijan, in Baku. They had one the year before in Dubai. They had one the year before in Sharm el-Sheikh, and they had them in Glasgow. They have them all every year. They have these, everybody jets in.
On their private jet.
Jets in on to get in on the climate change summit. And so in advance of this last November one, this guy quietly, as far as I could tell, hardly anybody picked up on this, but he basically made a speech in England and said, we got 2 years. We got 2 years to fix this climate problem. And I'm looking like, whoa. So I got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is we got 2 years. And
When he says 2 years, what does that entail?
Good question, because I was trying to figure that out. I mean, 2 years, was it a way to grab some headlines, which it didn't grab too many headlines. I didn't see it. But what did he mean by that? And as far as I could tell, and I even emailed the World Meteorological Organization to try to clarify where the 2-year figure came from, and they never got back to me, like everybody else doesn't get back. But as best I can tell, he's referring to the Paris Accords. So the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement, was a 2015 climate summit result. And you probably remember Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement, and Obama was in, and then Trump was out, and then Biden was back in, and Trump's going to pull out, and this and that. So these climate change summits are trying to get countries to do something. They're trying to get countries to cut back carbon emissions, basically. And the bad news is that countries really aren't. I mean, they've got some scientific data that indicates that climate has a little tipping point, temperature-wise. And so early on, there were these goals, and in Paris, they came up with these goals to not let the global temperature get to a certain point, because after that point, which is technically is 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial temperatures, let's not go past 1.5 Celsius, and we're going to have to do things now to cut carbon emissions so that we don't heat up more than that. Well, the bad news is we did. 2024 was the year where global temperatures finally hit the target that the Paris Agreement was trying to avoid. And so we're now entering a territory, and this is kind of science being tested in a crucible, because the scientists have been saying you're going to create destabilization in the climate at that temperature, and we're now there. So I think what Simon Steele was basically saying ahead of the last climate, shindig in Baku was, we only really have 2 more years. And to me, these climate change things are kind of like a parent of a 3-year-old saying, Tommy, no, Nikki, I'm going to count to 3. You stop doing that by the time I count to 3, or I'm going to smack you.
Except we're already
One.
at 10.
2, 2.5, 2 3/4, 2 5/8. You know, that's kind of what the world's been doing. I'm going to count to 1.5 Celsius, and then you're done. And then we just kind of
Keep up.
1.1 Celsius, 1.2. Come on. No real reaction. So, you know, the bad news is the temperatures are rising. The global land temperature, 2024 was the hottest on record. The ocean temperatures, we also have the highest ocean temperature on record, and ocean temperatures have been rising steadily since 1980. I think they started doing satellite measuring of ocean temperatures in like 81 or 84 or something. And every year, every decade, the temperature rises. And carbon emissions rise. And so, you know, the bad news is we're not being good about this. We're playing chicken with climate change. Now, there's some people out there that think climate change is a bunch of nonsense. We're going to find out. And just like LA is finding out, can I play chicken with living in a area that has no water?
Living in a desert.
Yeah. Can I live in a desert and have no water and have no real food resources here and bring in a few more million people and sell a few more houses and clog up a few more freeways and still live in LA? You know, I'm going to play chicken with that. You know, I for one, I'll tell you more about this later, but you know, I left.
You lived in LA.
Well, I lived in LA, yes, but I'm from San Diego. So my sojourn in LA was a temporary one. I was just kind of interested in the music business at that time, and so I was there. But it was like, oh, no way. I'm from the sleepy little surfing town, San Diego. I'm going back there. And then, lo and behold, it didn't stay that way. It became a suburb packed to suburb, packed to suburb. Everything's paved from Oceanside to Tijuana, and we're packing more people in all the time. And so we did leave, and I'll tell you more about that. But I wanted to say happy 2-year, because the good news is we've got 2 years. So 2 years to do something. And I think there are things that we can do. And I'm advocating that. I'm trying to do them myself. I'm trying to help people. And this is, you know, sort of, we've talked about a lot of different subjects in these podcasts, but today I want to focus on permaculture. And happy 2-year, there's things we can do. And this is what I spent a lot of my time doing, not only developing my own sustainable homestead, but trying to help others and network with others who are doing the same thing, because we came here because we felt that the Humboldt Bay Area was particularly positioned to be sustainable.
For that kind of lifestyle.
That's good. So
I do want to ask really fast.
Yeah.
With the Paris Climate Accords, do you know why they chose 1.5 degrees Celsius? Why that was the benchmark?
That was the work of scientists.
But is there any, are you aware of any reasoning behind that number?
Well, you can read all about it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I think it's the IPCC, puts out all kinds of scientific data on the thing. So, yeah, at some point they were asked, well, how much can we torque the climate? How much can we push the envelope? How much can we heat the planet up before we have any kind of serious problems? That was a legitimate scientific question, and they did modeling, and they've been working on this for decades. So,
and that was the number they came up with.
That was the number they came up with, that if we get past 1.5 degrees Celsius, we could see a precipitous shift of the entire climate system. And I think that, in my observation, the last 10 years we've been seeing that shift. More and more flooding, more and more fires, more and more extreme weather, more and more this and that, and more, and in a sense, more and more people ignoring it. Like, I was just thinking about, I saw a recent story about how the population of Florida is going up. That there are these news articles about who's going from what state to the other, and this and that, some demographic shifts. And, you know, Florida this last year had 2 major hurricanes, Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. And they were devastating to these areas in Florida. I have a buddy from college who was living in the path of Helene, and after Helene was over, the dude gave notice and moved. And he moved, shall we say, uphill. So he had no idea that Milton was on the heels.
Oh no.
So when he did that, he moved to a place that Milton didn't touch. So
he was clear for that one.
Yeah, I'm saying
okay.
bravo guy, but I'm just thinking there's so many people that should consider leaving Florida, not going there.
Well, how about the people that just rebuild in the same spot?
I'm
staying here. I'm going to conquer nature.
And that's a very human thing. All around the globe, people do that. They have a tsunami in Indonesia and they kill 200,000 people, and then everybody rebuilds right there. So migration, shall we say, by design is very rare. It's mostly migration by necessity. And so I'll talk about migration by design a little bit later, because that's exactly what we did.
One more follow-up for the temperature.
Yes,
what is that? Because I just want to set a foundation here. What does that mean with 1.5 degrees increase? Is that the average overall year over year? Is that...
There's different numbers. And so...
because some years are colder than others, some years are hotter than others. There's fluctuation.
Right. So there's... Yeah. And in retrospect, they adjust the numbers. So it's almost like the jobs numbers. They'll put out something, and then they get more data and they revise what was actually happening in the past. And that's what they're doing now. They're I guess the technical, I'm not a mathematician, not my strong suit, but from what I read, there's wiggle room on Paris still, what Paris was calling the point of no return. Maybe we haven't reached that quite yet. I think the point that Simon Steele was trying to make is we will. 2 years, happy 2 years. We got 2 years, or we're going to hit the wall or not. And the bad news is that we're not going to change. So that's we're gonna see how going off the cliff feels. Maybe it's a big drop off that cliff. Maybe it's not. We'll see. Now, the state of California is in the process of doing its 5th climate change assessment. And so when we first moved here, there was the publication of the 4th climate change assessment that the state of California did. And the 4th assessment, which I believe was 2018, and if anyone's interested, they should go to the state of California and look up climate change assessments. The 4th climate change assessment was done in regions. So the first 3 were kind of general California outlook. And then in 2018, they did this regional look. And so there's a whole thing on the North Coast because it's really different climate than, say, San Diego. So lumping them all into one state, is fine geographically, but not climate-wise. They're very different. So looking at the North Coast climate change assessment, the state made a few recommendations, again, a few years ago. And one of those recommendations was to have better infrastructure planning for transportation, energy, and water. And so, boom, look at the LA, huge infrastructure issues. So if you're living in a fire-prone area, you need to be able to have water. And we're going to find out why some of those hydrants went dry.
Why the reservoir was dry.
Yeah,
for a year, I think they're saying.
Yeah. I mean, they're exploring these things, but the infrastructure in LA, and this is true for every city, infrastructure always gets pushed to the back burner because it costs money and nobody has any money. And as we talked about last year, every government in our area has a budget deficit crisis that they're facing, which means cutting. So, of course, in LA, they cut some fire and they cut some of this and they cut some of that.
And then you start moving money from one spot to another.
You try to raise taxes. Everybody goes ballistic. They were able to raise taxes in November here. Everybody but Fortuna went ahead and okayed sales tax increases and stuff. So, I mean, infrastructure is a tricky one because people have to pay for it and people kind of don't want to unless their car goes into a sinkhole and then they're like, oh my God.
Screaming about the potholes.
Yeah, got to fix this thing. But one of the other things that the California State assessment mentioned was doing better emergency preparedness planning. And when I look at emergency preparedness planning, and I did this a lot as a journalist because every jurisdiction has to have some kind of emergency plan or they don't get any FEMA funds. But in my observation in San Diego, Colorado, here, the paradigm for emergency planning is how do we get people to sort of be able to survive for like 3 days? And then I guess the disaster is either over or FEMA has come, or there's some magic thing about 3 days. So the thing that emergency planners don't look at is what we would call the long emergency. The long emergency is what is going to hit parts of LA. The long emergency is hitting Florida. The long emergency. That's what happens when things can't get better right away. Imagine a disaster event in Humboldt, whether it's an earthquake, a forest fire, a flood, whatever it is, or imagine that there's a disaster somewhere else that affects our grid. And I think this is also something that emergency preparedness planners, who make a lot more money than I do, but they don't really take into consideration the fact that we're tied to a grid. So when they look at a region like Humboldt and they say, well, gee, what are our disasters? Boom, 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 boom. It's going to be either a flood or it's going to be forest fire or whatever, earthquake. They don't consider what might happen in Sonoma or Mendocino that's going to take our grid down. And that connectivity, I mean, you know as well as I do, you're driving south on 101 and you're seeing 18-wheelers trying to come up that way. We are on a pretty vulnerable stretch of road up here. And if 101 goes down, if the Eel River Bridge goes down, if there's flooding at the Humboldt County, at the border, where, there may be some lowlands in there, that's going to cause you a long emergency. And so just looking at that recommendation and thinking about disaster planning, and I think LA brings this to all of our minds, what would we do different if we knew that there's going to be the most devastating fire in history coming? What would we do different? And how prepared are we to last for a month without FEMA or help from the outside? How prepared are we to last 6 months? What about if things never go back to normal and we have to be living off of what we have right now for the rest of our lives? I mean, these are legitimate questions that I think a lot of people don't really want to look at, but they're the kind of questions that permaculturists are looking at all the time. We call it designing for disaster, because permaculture is a design system. It's a way of thinking about your habitat, your community, your property, your house, where there are these systems that you need to survive. You need food, water, shelter. There's these systems that you need. And how can you enhance your ability to meet your own needs? So in permaculture, we're designing a site, like say my little third of an acre in McKinleyville. We're designing that site. We're also designing McKinleyville. We're thinking about, where does McKinleyville get its water? Where does McKinleyville get its food and energy and stuff? Not just my little spot, but what about my neighbors? How are they situated? Are we creating mutual help networks now so that we can help each other if the long emergency finally hits us? So Those are the kind of things that we permies are thinking about all the time.
Is permaculture adjacent to prepping? Or is prepping the extreme of permaculture?
No, it's a good question. Permaculture and prepping have, say, 50% in common. The 50% that they have in common are people feel like the grid might go down anytime soon and I need to be ready. The permaculture answer is the other 50%. What are you going to do about that? Now, the prepper is like, I got my stuff and I got my gun, and you're not going to take anything from me, and I'm good. The permy approach is like, well, hey, let's do this together. If the hordes come up from San Francisco because an earthquake took the entire city down and everybody's trying to find a safe place to land, and they're bringing weapons and they're going to come to my place and steal all my food. That's kind of the prepper attitude. My attitude is, dude from San Francisco, help me farm. I've got this corner over here that I'm trying to cultivate food. Stay in the community. As a community, let's rise from these ashes, not me against you. So
less isolationist.
The cooperative paradigm rather than a competitive one is how I describe it. So permaculture is a collaborative paradigm. It's like there's a big we in this. And in fact, there's even a movement called transition that grew out of permaculture. Transition town is another word for it. But it's how do we do large-scale permaculture? How do we design Humboldt Bay? How do we design Eureka, Arcata, McKinleyville? How do we come up with design systems that are going to help those communities survive? Not just how am I going to collect rainwater on my property, although I've got a couple thousand gallons of rainwater sitting around right now in my barrels. But
it almost feels more libertarian in that aspect, where you are focused on bringing the communities together to be self-sustaining, rather than just, oh, this is my property, I'm going to hold it and do what I need to, and everyone else is screwed.
What's more libertarian?
That idea of permaculture.
Well, in some ways, maybe permaculture is more, I think there's a strong libertarian streak in permaculture in the sense that decentralization is huge. But the idea that we got to take care of each other, I don't think is libertarian. I think libertarian is more like pursuing my selfish interests is the best thing for society. And I don't think that that's a basis for permaculture at all. So I wouldn't call permaculture libertarian, but those are labels, and so personally, I'm somewhat libertarian, I'm somewhat socialist, and I'm somewhat communist, and I'm somewhat Christian, and I'm this and that, I'm
a mix of things.
I'm a mix of things, and please don't put a label on me.
Don't typecast me.
I guess if you're going to label me, you can call me a permaculturist. So the permaculture solution, this is how I lay it out. The good news is the permaculture solution can be developed nonstop, full speed ahead. There's no barrier to it for 2 years. And that is one, building self-reliance in Humboldt, this somewhat remote region. The notion of self-reliance, I think, is important. It's not self-sufficiency. It's not prepper autonomy. It's self-reliance. How can we rely on ourselves to be more able to meet our own needs? The second part of that is closely aligned is the localization of food, water, and energy resources. So again, this is the decentralization pillar, if you will. How do we meet our own needs here? So just to give an example, in Los Angeles, you have millions and millions of people. I think it's 11 million, I could be wrong, in the Los Angeles region that rely on the Colorado River and the Sacramento Delta for their water. I don't know what the figures are. I know in San Diego, which also relies on the Colorado River and the Sacramento Delta for most of its water, there's I think they're saying at best 30% of the water that San Diegans use is from local sources. I don't know what that figure is like for LA. I haven't studied it, but I'm going to guess that it's less than that the local rainfall, the local freshwater reserves that you could get inside the LA County bioregion cannot support 11 million people. And so there's importing of water from somewhere else. Switch over here to Humboldt. We're actually a water producing area. We have, in Humboldt, we rely on the Mad River for our water. Okay, we don't rely on the Eel River or any of the other 6. We rely on the Mad River. Mad River comes out of the hills. Ruth Lake comes down, gravity fed, straight here into the ocean, and we intercept it on the way. And we have enough water from that Mad River to service 90,000 people in this region, and then have extra that they want to sell off, to help LA or whoever else needs the Central Valley farmers or whatever they're doing. So that's a good thing. That's good news. Good news is we have water resources here. Good news, we have food resources here. We have farms. We have a North Coast Growers Association that puts on farmers markets all over the place. And we have other farms that are not necessarily related to that we can get things from. So food and water are more abundant here than any place I've ever lived. Definitely not like Colorado. I lived in Colorado Springs. Okay. Colorado is following suit with Southern California. They're trying to get people to come. They're trying to build a lot of houses and say, how you survive 50 years from now is kind of up to you. We don't know. So the water resources are really bad in Colorado. Ironically, the Colorado River, which is where LA and San Diego get most of their water, the headwaters of the Colorado River is on the west side of the Rockies, not where all the cities in Colorado. So the cities, Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, all the major cities in Colorado are on the wrong side of the Rockies. They're on the dry side. So the clouds come over, they rain on the western slope, and then there's nothing left, and we have prairie and going east. And that's where the cities are. So the only way that they could sell houses in Colorado Springs over the last 100 years was to build a pipeline over the Rockies. So Colorado Springs is completely dependent upon, except for a few reservoirs on Pikes Peak, completely dependent upon being able to pump water over 100 miles. Not a good recipe for self-reliance, not a good recipe for having resilience.
Yep, the grid goes down, what happens?
Yeah, and that's
kiss your water goodbye.
That's the other thing, energy. And so, developing, in particular, developing solar is a good thing for the North Coast because we got solar arrays and they make electrons for here. The power plant that we rely on, the one that's down at King Salmon, is burning natural gas now, and it's burning, I think then there's another plant that's burning wood debris, the biomass plant. And I told you about the nuclear plant that they decommissioned, but they didn't take the waste away. So it's still sitting in King Salmon. But that power plant, fortunately, got worked on so that it is you can cut it off from the grid. You can send power to us from it. It's on a globalized grid like everything is. We're sending electrons all over the world through the transmission lines. But here, if there's a power outage, we can kind of, I guess they can kind of flip a switch. And now the power plant at King Salmon can just power us. But we've built a solar array at the airport, And there's the Blue Lake tribe has built a solar array there. So there's been definite investment in local energy, and that's a good thing for us.
Do you know why Texas has its own power grid? Why they're the only state in the union that does that? Does that just
I don't know.
come from how they
I
became a state?
I don't even know that that's true, but
I'm pretty sure that
it sounds familiar.
Texas is on a separate grid than the rest of the U.S.
I don't know for sure. I know that they've had some issues. And Texas, well, I won't go into it, but I'm not living there.
You wouldn't go to Texas?
I would not go to
I've been thinking about Texas.
Don't go.
But then you hear about the snow, and I would just completely gridlocks that place, and you think, ah.
Texas is...
What's your qualms with Texas?
I don't think that Texas is positioned for sustainability and resilience. I think what we've seen is, Texas is hugely invested in fossil fuels. So the majority of Texans don't want to get away from that because their livelihood or somebody they know or someone they're related to is tied up in producing these nasty fuels. The problem is that Texas is seeing more extreme weather. They're having, they've had some blizzards that they weren't expecting and the grid went down. They've had some heat. I visited Texas for the birth of my granddaughter, who's now 2. And it was over 100 degrees every day we were there. That is not a sustainable place to live because why? You have to have air conditioning from some source just to live there. This is, a sign that I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go somewhere where I have to have a machine. It's like being in a hospital bed on an iron lung. I got a machine that keeps me alive. How sustainable is that? I don't want to be on life support. So I'm looking for a place where there are local resources, and I think that we would call that part of the permaculture solution. Just in real kind of short terms, I would say this, that the permaculture solution, the good news is that we are shifting paradigms. We're shifting to what I call the 21st century paradigm, because I think the 21st century is a turning point. And what we grew up with in the 20th century, me more than you probably have the majority of your life in the 21st century, but I've spent half my life in each, basically. So the excess that we had in the 20th century is going away. The access to cheap, clean energy is going away. The climate is rapidly changing. The era of American exceptionalism, I think, is going away, where Americans think everybody's going to do things for them. I mean, I can't believe how people are bitching and moaning about Gavin Newsom, like he's responsible for the devastation in L.A. Why did you live in L.A.? When you lived in L.A., did you stock your place with water and food? Were you prepared for an emergency? Was that Gavin Newsom's responsibility to come down from Sacramento and make you have emergency preparations? What about your house? Did you have a fire suppression system? I mean, you're from Humboldt. You know we have this up here. You know there's 150 feet of defensible space. This is like people live in forests up here. Fortunately, in McKinleyville, we don't. But people live pretty close to the edge of the forest, and you need to have defensible space. This is something that I saw billboards for when I first got here. It's like, it's my job to protect my house, not Gavin Newsom's, not the fire department's. Why can't I have my system ready? Why can't I have water? When we visited Australia was going through, this is about 10 years ago, Australia was going through this huge problem of what they call bushfires. So in Australia, bush is what we would call rural. They call it the bush. And we lived we stayed for a couple of weeks in the bush, at these people's house, and they were involved in the permaculture community. And one of the guys that co-founded permaculture lives right down there in Victoria, Australia, and we went to his house several times, and lo and behold, there was a bushfire alert while we were there, and they have it down. We got on ladders, they closed these things over the windows. They had these things so that the fire couldn't come up against the window. And we filled the gutters with water. We hosed down the house, and we waited for the bushfire to come. And fortunately, it didn't come. Went somewhere else. The wind blew it somewhere else. So but in the Australian bush, people are taking care of themselves. They're ready. They're not waiting for someone else to take care of them.
But they're also
please,
not as
take care of me.
They're also not as closely packed as people in LA. You got a little more space to be defensible.
That begs the question. Why would you live 5 feet away from another house? Why would you do that if you were concerned about your neighborhood burning down? Do people in Southern California think seriously about emergency preparedness? I used to be one of those people living there. How many people had extra water? How many people had extra food? How many people were ready to defend their house against a fire? How many people were... Nobody. It's like head in the sand time in Southern California. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to make light of people's tragedies. This is a tragic thing that's happened. It was tragic in Florida. All of these disasters are tragic. But why aren't we preparing for this? We got 2 years. Happy 2 year, Nick. We got 2 years. So these are the shifts that I want to see and that I'm actively working on. And by the way, I just want to mention, if anybody's listened this far, I have a website. It's called adventuresinpermaculture.com. adventuresinpermaculture.com. And I have a Substack dedicated to the intersection of sustainability and spirituality called The Catholic Farmer. And that is at abufrancis.substack.com. abufrancis.substack.com. And this is where I do a lot of the writing about these subjects. I do journalism, but I want to pontificate and pundit and whatever. And my punditry is pretty backed by research and news. So it's worth, I think it's worth reading. I don't know about anybody else, but so these are the three things that I'm looking for. One is moving from being consumers to being producers. It's amazing to me that people are willing to accept the identity of a consumer. I'm a consumer. What do consumers think? What does the consumer board think? When you think I'm a consumer, that means you're using up resources. What do you produce? If you're not producing the kinds of things you need to survive, you're going out and consuming them from somebody else who produces them, then all you're producing is carbon emissions. You want to move from being a consumer of resources to a producer of things that you need to survive. The second way to look at it, in the last election, the last three elections, moving from being voters to leaders. I don't personally need a leader. I don't need a president. I don't need a governor. I don't need a city council. I'm willing to lead, and my neighbors are willing to lead. These are the leaders that I need, me and my neighbors. I could care less about the need for all this leadership because I think they're leading us off a cliff.
I don't know. You're starting to sound pretty libertarian right here.
Well, libertarian, anarchist, villagist, Gandhiist.
Communityist.
There's a lot of ways you might describe it. Libertarian, I think, I brush up against libertarianism in the sense that that's decentralism, but I depart from a lot of libertarian ideas, which I feel are overly focused on just doing my thing. Don't you tell me what to do. I think that's narrow. I think that there's a socialization, whether you call it socialism, communism, community, whatever you want to call it. We have neighbors. We live in a society that's made up of all of these people, not just me. I can't go through life saying, what's just good for me? Screw you. I can't do that. That's kind of how I would characterize straight libertarianism. I'm doing my thing. Screw you. Don't you tell me what to do. I'm not there. And that leads me to the third paradigm shift that I'm pursuing, and that is moving from neighborhoods to villages. And this whole thing I call village shift, where we spent over a century on what I would call corporate shift, where everything started to move towards large centralized business interests running everything, and Wall Street running everything, and the military industrial complex pushing out American empire, extracting resources with the barrel of a gun, doing everything to help business interests here in the United States. We need to move away from the corporate paradigm to the village paradigm. Villages is how most people throughout human history have lived. People have lived in, tribes, clans, whatever you want to call it. You can look at, anthropology and history, whatever. People have lived together in small groups, whatever they were called. And I think the village is a pretty good image that, sure, I live in a neighborhood or I live in a community, but what about a village? What is it about a village? No, the village has a bunch of people that know each other and they're kind of helping each other. And this guy definitely grows, killer strawberries, and that guy definitely can repair your fan, and that guy can change your oil. I mean, there's just like this notion that we together represent all the skills that we all need. And I think there's a bunch of villages everywhere. We've just blurred those lines with counties and states and this and that. And in McKinleyville, McKinleyville has about 15,000 people. And I'd say there's probably 10 to 15 village areas where people, if they didn't have cars, they could still meet all their needs. And that, I think, is something that we have 2 years to prepare for, not having cars.
You think we're going to lose cars?
It's quite possible, yeah. I would call it the grid going down. The grid might go down. I mean, they're playing some pretty dangerous games in geopolitical terms.
So this is separate from just a purely climate issue. This would be more possibly geopolitical.
Well, in the sense that, and I'm getting this from David Holmgren, the guy in Australia who helped co-found permaculture with Bill Mollison. And I talked to David Holmgren at length about this, and he wrote a little book called Future Scenarios, where he tried to sort of articulate 4 different paths that we could go down, and he published that early in the 2000s. But he said, let's look at climate change. Is it going to be precipitous? Is it going to be fast? Or is it going to be slow? Let's look at the availability of energy. Are we going to have lots of cheap energy, or is it going to go away slow? And third, how will climate change and the availability of fuel, of energy, affect civic unrest? So those are kind of 3 what I would call signs of the times. I put on my Abu Francis hat, signs of the times. Climate change, the availability of energy, and civil unrest. We're entering a time when all of those things are going to go off the charts. 2 years. Happy 2 year. We're seeing increased global instability. We're seeing increased civil unrest. And part of that is manifesting itself in BRICS. And we talked a little bit about BRICS on another podcast. And BRICS has just taken in Cuba as another partner. BRICS is now bigger than the G7 in terms of its population and its GDP, combined GDP. BRICS is the current alternative to American empire. So you got people like Biden and Trump. There was Biden, now we got Trump, all marching down the road of American empire. Pax Americana. Let's keep the U.S. running everything. Let's make sure we're in control. They're even talking about how climate change is opening up new shipping lanes through the Arctic, and Who's going to control that so we can ship oil here? And I mean, they're lunatics. This is lunacy. Thinking that this energy intensive, consumptive kind of empire thing is going to last. It's not going to last. We're in debt. I don't know if you're in debt, but credit card debt is at an all-time high, and so is government debt. And you look around us, every government we can see is in debt and deficit spending. These are not signs of the times that say prosperity is on its way. Now, that's part of the bad news, but the good news is we have 2 years. Happy 2 year. We have 2 years to try to get ready for that, to adapt to climate change, to adapt to increasingly expensive energy, to adapt to, whatever happens in terms of civil unrest and war and coups and whatever goes on. So I wanted to close and jump in with a question if you want, man.
Well, with this, what do you see happening? So say this 2 years is definitive. What do you see that culminating as in 2 years? What do you think pops off? That the climate just becomes completely erratic, or that the geopolitical factors come in and there's some societal unrest? What do you think that 2 year deadline, what does that translate to for you?
Well, I think the question I have to ask myself is, and I would ask anybody, I would ask you, will there be a catastrophic climate event? Now, there can be all kinds of catastrophic events. For all we know, tomorrow an asteroid will go by and reverse the poles on the planet Earth and everything will go down. I mean, we don't know. That could happen. There's all we're vulnerable. Okay, we're vulnerable.
Very vulnerable.
And I don't want to go through my life going, oh my God, I'm scared, I'm vulnerable. That's not the response for me. What I want to say is, how do I minimize my vulnerability? How do I minimize my risk? How do I be responsible in such a way that I can maybe survive a catastrophe? I can be of some value in helping my family and friends survive. I can't save the world. I can't stop asteroid X from putting out a sunspot electromagnetic pulse and shutting down the entire electrical grid for 6 months. I can't control that, but I can say, let's be ready. Let's help each other if there's a crisis. And so we embarked on something which I call migration by design. And you'll hear about climate migration. It's becoming an increasingly big topic as people have to leave areas that have become devastated. And so there are hundreds of thousands of climate migrants. I'm not even talking about climate refugees. There's more of those people who it's uninhabitable where they lived. Climate migrants is kind of the category I'm in, which is I could live there, but I'm going to go somewhere better. And this is something that my forebears and probably your ancestors did at one point. They left wherever they were and they came to America because whatever was going on in Europe or what was going on wherever they came from, it didn't look good. And so they left. We did that too. So what happened is in 2013, my wife and I became certified permaculturists. We went on a trip to Australia and we spent 3 to 4 months talking to the permaculturists down there who had started this thing, had been doing it for 25, 30 years, trying to get our head wrapped around it. And we came back and decided that Colorado was not the place to stay. Colorado is headed for warmer temperatures, less water, more people. Go figure that one out. So we decided to look for something better, more sustainable. And we developed a series of design criteria, what we call in permaculture, design criteria. What are you looking for? And so we had, 20, 25 of these design criteria. Some of them we would consider non-negotiable. Some of them were like, okay, well, maybe we can get this, maybe we can get that. And so we set out to try to find a place where we could settle that would meet, 80, 90% of our design criteria. And we came back out to California. We didn't even think twice about Southern California, but we came back out to the north and we made 2 coastal trips, documented that in a little video we call Transition West Coast, and talked to all of these permaculturists from Marin to Seattle about what they thought was going on the North Coast. And all of this is at our website, adventuresinpermaculture.com. We decided on Humboldt. And we came out to Humboldt in 2017. It was a year of great weather disasters across the country. It was beginning to feel like what we now are looking at as normal life. Anything can happen to anybody, and it's going to be a disaster. That in my consciousness, that was going on in 2017. We came out here. I got a job. That was part of our decision-making process. I needed to have a job before we came out. I didn't want to sell our house in Colorado and come out here and just become homeless. So that's dumb.
Yeah, good call.
Yeah. Although I could, but I'd rather go to Hawaii and be homeless. But so we came out here. I got offered a job pretty solidly by Eureka Natural Foods to be a cook in Eureka Natural Foods in McKinleyville. We came out. We lived for a year in the freshwater area, actually up off of Pigeon Point. We lived in Levon's yurt. So Levon is like the mushroom guy here.
I've had him on the podcast.
Yeah. Okay. So Levon's a great guy. Levon welcomed us. Marlon Gill from Freshwater welcomed us. The Permies really welcomed us and helped us get established here. And we started looking for properties, and we had, again, these design criteria. And right when we were kind of ready to leave, this property that we live at now came up on Craigslist, and it was just almost perfect. Everything matched our design criteria. Sun exposure, flat, water, kind of a rural, semi-rural, if you will. McKinleyville's kind of semi-rural, although some parts of it now are very urban. And the only thing that wasn't, it was kind of small. It was 1/3 of an acre instead of 2, which is what we were at originally and trying to find. But it was obvious to us that we needed to get it. So we took the money we had made from selling our house in Colorado, which sat in the bank, and we bought this place. And funny enough, the guy we bought it from was moving to Colorado. So we did not increase the population.
It was an equal trade.
It was a trade. So we came and we've been developing the site ever since. Of course, COVID kind of put a damper on a lot of that. But we did a permaculture design certification course. We certified 10 other permies. We took shepherdship of the Humbucks virtual currency that had existed prior several decades in Humboldt that we had read about, famously the Humbucks system, because any kind of system that allows people to exchange rather than need cash is really important.
It's just a barter system?
It's a virtual currency. So Humbucks, I mean, it's evolved so that you can trade out time, you can gift. There's different ways of developing an economy that's not based on money. And the more we can do that, the better, because the problem with money is you got to work for somebody to get it. And so you got to, do whatever you got to do so you can pay that rent and buy that food from some farmer somewhere, and you can't get out of it. So the only way you can get out of that is to become more of a producer and find ways to need less cash. So Humbucks is a way. Humbucks.org is the website for that. And we have several hundred members, and we're trying to develop more ways for people to exchange. So I can use that truck. I can borrow that truck from somebody, maybe somebody I don't know. In the Humbuck system, you don't do a direct trade. You don't go, Nick, can I borrow your truck? And then I'll make you a Thai dinner, one-on-one trade. I can borrow your truck with humbucks, and somebody else can pay me to do the Thai dinner with the humbucks. It doesn't have to be a straight barter. So we're trying to create more of those. We started a Buy Nothing McKinleyville page. Buy Nothing is a little bit of a movement to create more of a giving economy. I got this, I want to give somebody. I need this. Can anybody give it to me? So there's all these kind of things, and we have links to all of these tools at adventuresinpermaculture.com. So we are trying to build these systems, the water, soil, and sun systems that are needed for life. We got greenhouses, we've got water catchment, we're mulching, we're composting. We got a horse across the street. So we've made a deal where they load up the horse manure in a wheelbarrow. I'll take it across the street and compost it. And they don't have to worry about where to take it because they don't have any place to take it. So these are the kinds of connections we're trying to make, and increase the fertility of our soil and our ability to feed ourselves. Our goal is to be able to grow at least 50% of our own food in the next 2 years. Happy 2 year. So 2 years from now, we want to be able to be at least halfway to feeding ourselves. And the other half, we might have to exchange, or we might have to break down and go to a farmer's market or whatever. There's a whole kind of, if you will, hierarchy of where you want to be. So you want to be able to get your food and the things you need from yourself or your neighbors if possible. And then if you can't do that, then you want to go to some, like a farmer, or join a CSA, community support agriculture, some kind of a way for you to access a farmer that's local. And then if you can't find that, you need to go to a locally owned retailer. So like Eureka Natural Foods is a great example. The Co-op is another example. These are stores that are not chains. They're not tied to some corporate plan. They're not on Wall Street. They're owned by local people, and they're stocking the products of local people. And then if, you just can't get it there, break down and go to a chain. That's flipping the paradigm upside down, because most of the time we go to Safeway or Walmart or Costco first, and then maybe I can get some onions from my neighbor, and put that on the top of my whatever I'm making. So there's a huge upside down movement that needs to go with our food paradigm, but we're working on that, trying to make that happen. And we are building, the last thing I'm going to mention is we're building a natural house. It's 1,000 square foot. We call it a cottage. It's an ADU behind our existing house. We're making it out of light straw clay. And that has been, in August, that was approved by the planning department. We had to have an engineer come in and say, okay, this can be done. And we got an engineer through the California Straw Bale Association. So the guy was from Eureka, lives in Truckee. We did all this stuff remote. And he came up with the engineering for the earthquake and the ground and the shaking and whatever he needed to come up with. So the county has signed off on it. So we're going to be building a foundation in the next couple of months. The foundation we're going to do, we want to minimize concrete, because cement and concrete are huge carbon emitters. In fact, the global cement industry is responsible for about 10% of carbon emissions in the world. And the demand for concrete and cement are going up. The more we pave and the more we build, and the more people in emerging countries want to have buildings like they got in the United States. Damn it. So we're driving up that carbon footprint. So our response is to drive it back down on our property if we can. And if we can figure out how to do that, maybe the next person can do that too. So we're using a product out of Oregon called Fast Walls. And Fast Walls are these jumbo cinder blocks. They're probably like twice as big as your average cinder block that you have. They're these jumbo cinder blocks, and they're 85% wood fiber. And they've done an amalgam where with just 15% of the cement, they can make a structurally sound wall with them. And so we're ready to excavate our little perimeter trench and put these fast wall blocks in it. And then we'll be using about 50% of the concrete that we would otherwise be using in a conventional build. We're not going to be using any toxic materials. I mean, the building industry uses toxic, nasty materials all the time, usually because they're faster and cheaper and easier to do than these natural materials. But what we're finding, like when your house burns down in LA, guess what? You released a whole bunch of crap into the air because that was what your house was built out of. So we're doing our part, and we're building this thing, and we're hoping that we can have you over for dinner this time in a year. This time.
Are you going to document this build and put it up on your website?
Well, we are trying to. We're way behind on writing about it, but
because that'd be fascinating to see the process as you guys are building it out.
What we want to do is we want to have it step by step, so that somebody else could say, "Well, gee, I want to do a natural build. How'd they do it?" And if the more we can kind of pioneer, the more to us it's worth the extra money we're spending.
Because then you're paving the way for somebody else.
Yeah. So,
how did you and your wife get interested in permaculture initially? Were you concerned about the climate back then?
Always. I've been what you might call an environmentalist my whole life, and part of that is growing up in San Diego and watching the smog start to roll in. And as a kid, that was like, whoa, it's getting smoggy here. That's not good. And I did when I was in third grade. I did live in LA for a year. My dad had a job up there, and then he came back. And I remember driving by the Long Beach refineries when I was 10, looking at the smoke just pouring. Have you ever seen a Long Beach refinery?
No.
It was like, oh my God, look at all that smoke going in the air. I don't want to do that. So when Earth Day rolled around, Earth Day was 1970, I was 12, and I was really into it. It was like I have a little scrapbook, and I cut out all the headlines and the newspaper articles and have my little Earth Day scrapbook. And Earth Day was one day, and then it was over. 20 years later, in 1990, people said, well, let's have another Earth Day. And so I was involved in the Earth Day committee in San Diego for a few years. So that's kind of my background. But the problem with environmentalism is that it's not necessarily about sustainability. So you start hearing the word sustainability coming up in the 2000s. Environmentalism becomes kind of an old green becomes kind of not exciting. Let's keep rebranding whatever we're talking about here. Sustainability became kind of passé. But part of the reason it is because it's not really defined. What is sustainability? And I remember talking to one of my supervisors in San Diego, and we were talking about sustainability. And she said, well, why do you just want to sustain? Don't you want to grow? And it's like, oh my God, she doesn't get it at all. Permaculture has a certain approach to sustainability, which I've been trying my best to outline. And I think it's very tangible. It's concrete. There are the systems we're trying to build. There's a path we're trying to go down that will result in maybe some of us surviving whatever's ahead, and maybe even thriving with whatever's ahead. Now, we don't know what's ahead. We don't know what's going to happen after 2 years. We're going to find out. I hope that you're there. I hope I'm here. I hope that together we survive. And happy 2 years.
Happy 2 years. Okay, Steve, do you want to wrap there? You got anything else? Okay, we'll save it for the next one. Thanks, Steve.